Great. Well, thank you very much for coming, both of you. Just to say that Bright Blue is doing a project, a year-long project, trying to carve out a new balanced centre-right approach on immigration. There's various different elements to the project, but one of them is this commission. We've already received submissions from individuals and organisations, written evidence back in August, and the second component of the commission is this oral evidence session today, where we're inviting a variety of people to come in across different policy areas. This will be video, so it will be up online in a few weeks' time, and the transcripts from this will be produced, will be published in a final report, which is coming out at the end of the year. So it will be kind of in the appendix, and then there'll be a list of policies from Bright Blue at the start of that report. The commissioners here from a variety of backgrounds and have different perspectives. They won't necessarily endorse every policy idea, but they're going to give you some searching questions today. So how we'll do it is that I will ask you to introduce yourself and then give some introductory remarks on how you think the immigration system affects families and children at the moment. I know, Natasha, you've got particular expertise in focus on refugees, and so Don, it'd be great if you could be wider than that. So we'll start with Natasha.
Thanks very much. I realise that you're asking me to speak about families and children, but actually I'm going to speak about women, and a lot of the women that we work with don't come with their families or their children. But I want to talk about them as women, if that's all right, in the asylum process. Talking about women in the asylum process.
Just say who you are as well.
Sorry, I'm Natasha Walter. I'm the founder and director of Women for Refugee Women. In speaking about women in the asylum process, I don't for a moment want to suggest that there aren't areas for reform in the rest of the immigration system, or that there aren't areas for reform for men in the asylum process. But I want to concentrate specifically on women in the asylum process. That's the area we work in. And I think it's really important in the wider context of looking at reform across the immigration asylum process that you don't lose sight of the specific needs and vulnerabilities of women. Just to contextualise that a little, I hope that everybody here is aware of some of the valuable work that's been done recently, looking at the needs of women across the globe, the impact of gender-based violence on women, and steps that this government can take to protect and protect women and prevent gender-based violence. So, looking at steps taken by this government, for instance, we welcome the Foreign Office initiative to end sexual violence in conflict, or the government's initiative to tackle female genital mutilation. I'm sure you're aware that there's been work done over many years looking at how female survivors of sexual violence are treated in the criminal justice system, and that's something that's also being continued by this government. But there is an area that has been missed out, and that is what happens to women who cross borders, who are survivors of gender-based violence. And working with women who seek asylum in the UK, we are aware that the majority of these women are survivors of gender-based violence. We've carried out research among samples of the women that we work with, women living in the community and women in detention centres, and we find that the majority of those women have survived rape and sexual violence as part of the persecution they're fleeing. They've come to this country to seek safety, and they should be given protection. Instead, what we find is that too often their trauma is actually compounded by their experiences in the asylum process, that too often they are disbelieved or their experiences are trivialised and they're refused asylum here. And we're also particularly concerned about the use of detention in the asylum process and how traumatic that is. I mean, immigration detention is hugely problematic per se, but it is particularly difficult for people who are survivors of torture, imprisonment and sexual violence. And recent research that we carried out among women who were currently or recently detained, we found that 1 in 5 of those we spoke to said she had tried to commit suicide in immigration detention, and 1 in 3 had been on suicide watch. Nearly 2,000 women seeking asylum were detained in the UK in 2012, And we feel that is one area that cries out for reform, that would be a straightforward reform to make, and I hope that you will take that on board.
You mentioned a majority of women in detention centres and seeking asylum suffered some form of gender-based violence. Is that just through the conversations you've had, or is this more rigorous?
That's through our research among a small sample of women who are currently or recently detained, 46 women. We would love to have statistics from the Home Office about how many. I mean, we'd love to have. There's so many areas that it's so difficult to campaign and move on because we can't get information out of the Home Office, and that is one of the key areas. We can't get the Home Office to disclose, for instance, the grounds on which women seek asylum or the experiences of people who have been detained. It's very, very difficult to get information from the Home Office. We therefore have to rely on our small samples. We're always very honest about how many people we've spoken to and under what circumstances, but we recognise that there is a need for the Home Office to disclose more evidence.
Do we know the acceptance rates? Do you know the acceptance rates on first decision and appeal across genders? Is there any disparity across genders in those?
It's roughly equivalent on first decision. What flags up to us that there's a problem specifically on women's asylum cases is that more of the first refusals given to women are overturned on appeal than the first refusals given to men. So about 30% of the first refusals given to women are then overturned on the first appeal, whereas it's lower for men. In terms of
what percentage is overturned? 30%?
30% on the first appeal. I mean, a larger number will then go on to be given some kind of leave to remain maybe further down the line. But it's 30% on women's asylum decisions.
We were just told earlier by somebody from one of the refugee organisations that it was 50%.
You're talking about the appeals granted,
appeal.
First appeals granted. We were given 50% was the cumulative of first decision. That isn't the same.
Oh.
That isn't the same thing.
It's very difficult. Because the cohort, you had to track it over time to see sort of final outcomes. So that the 30% is what happens on the first appeal.
Okay, thank you very much. Over to Don.
Thanks. I'm Don Flynn. I'm the director of the Migrants' Rights Network. On the issue of family reunion policy, I think that's probably the main thing I'm going to sketch out here. It's long been one of the most contentious issues in immigration policy. It's for decades it ranked as being the principal route for settlement in the country, particularly after 1973. The effect of the Immigration Act of 1971 came into effect on the 1st of January 1973, basically put an end to primary immigration for an extended period, the migration of workers, particularly unskilled, semi-skilled workers. And the principal route of settlement into the country from that point onwards was family reunification. And for a long period, particularly as far as the position of Commonwealth citizens were concerned, the route was fairly open, or in theory, the route for settlement was fairly open. In practice, it was more difficult. The requirement in the immigration rules was that the sponsor of a family being able to demonstrate that he, and in most instances it was a he, was related as claimed to the people he was seeking to sponsor. And for most Commonwealth citizens that was easily done, or for citizens of most Commonwealth citizens that was easily done, with the noticeable exceptions, and very important exceptions, of people from Pakistan and Bangladesh, who were chronically disadvantaged by this rule, because particularly people coming from the areas of Mirpur and Sylhet, the two major centres of migration to the UK, they simply didn't have documentation. There was no such thing as birth certificates, and marriage certificates were a fairly late innovation in those states. And this gave opportunities for immigration officials to refuse applications on the basis that the relationship had not been proven. And it was a major issue. I think anybody who was around in the 1970s and the 1980s concerned with immigration issues, and I was working for law centres in central London, it was simply a massive part of your caseload, making representations on behalf of people whose families had been refused entry into the country, and it extended across many years. In this process, it was finally resolved with the advent of the DNA fingerprint test, which it was possible on the basis of blood samples to be able to demonstrate a blood relationship between the sponsor and the children, and the usually the mother of the children. And at that point, it was determined that something like well in excess of 90% of applicants who were related as claimed, and that the refusal levels of earlier periods had been wholly unwarranted. I think probably the other issue was the famous primary purpose rule, which is a rule that many people confuse with marriages of convenience. It was intended to deter marriages of convenience. In fact, they weren't. It was a rule that was applied after the issue of whether the marriage was bogus or not had been settled, and it was accepted that a genuine marriage relationship was intended. But the primary purpose rule was a test of the motivation for entering into that marriage. What were the particular factors which made it a desirable marriage? And in the position of people, particularly from India and Pakistan and the Indian subcontinental countries, the entry clearance officers felt that they had ample scope for being able to argue that it was the fact that the opportunity to settle in the UK was a major motivating force in allowing family settlement. And once again, I think anybody who was working in and around the Indian subcontinental communities at that time, working in giving advice, citizens advice bureaus, law centres and so on and so forth, would tell you that it was a major part of the casework that they were taking up, was contesting.
Can I ask you, John, just to come to sort of modern day, as it were, and
Yeah,
some of the
sure.
issues around that?
Well, the current situation is that the marriage sponsorship continues to be problematic. The principal source of that nowadays is the very recent requirement to demonstrate what we regard to be a very high earnings threshold for a person sponsoring a partner. It's £18,600 in order to be able to bring them into the country. There is that rises for each child coming into the country on top of that. So very quickly, so even at £18,600, it's something in the region of about 40% of the wage earning population falls below that level. And there are other factors to be taken into account outside of London and the South East. The proportion of people falling below that wage level rises very considerably. There are also disadvantages for women who are seeking to sponsor. There's a very clear gender discrimination that's built into it, because women who are trying to sponsor men to come into the country, particularly when children are involved and the women are looking after children, are likely to have considerable disadvantages in terms of their ability to earn wages. In addition to that, I'll also briefly mention the question of language. There is also now a very stiff language requirement in order to be able to sponsor a family member, which with the language test having to be undertaken whilst the family member is out of the country. And I think probably the third factor is that these problems seem to be aggravated. There's a very keen sense of injustice, I think, across a lot of communities because they compare and contrast their situation with those of European Union migrants who, because of the protection they get under the Treaty of Rome, are entitled to sponsor their family members coming into the country, including where their family members are not themselves citizens of the European Union, simply on the basis of being able to produce evidence of a relationship, a marriage certificate or a birth certificate establishing the relationship, and no test of income or language applies in those cases. So I think I conclude by saying that family reunification continues to be. There's a long history, and we know the consequences of it. There are a lot of the very ingrained grievances that exist within South Asian communities against the British authorities do go back to that period, the battles that they had to wage in the 70s and 80s in order to bring their family members into them. If their issues have now been resolved, they're being reproduced, we feel, in a new generation of not only migrants, but the British citizen sponsors of migrants who have got very long, very protracted battles ahead of them in order to be able to bring their family members in as well.
Can I ask Don? So the minimum income test, which was introduced in 2012, I think, how many people have seen as a result of this not being able to bring their spouses in? I mean, just how many people have been stopped from family reunification because of this rule?
The estimate is something in the region of 18,000 people have been refused entry into the country on the basis of the income element. It has been somewhat, the statistics have to be clarified because, of course, there was a decision that was given in a lower tribunal that challenged this on human rights grounds. And in fact, from that date onwards, I think it was getting on to about 12 months or so, no decision, wherever the issue of income arose, then a decision was simply postponed. And there was a huge backlog began to build up. So it's not been a normal year. The past 12 months, whilst we've been waiting for the courts to finally rule on this matter, have not been a normal year. But our estimate is that somewhere between 17,000 and 18,000 people have been refused as a consequence of this.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Don, but I guess there are many more that didn't apply in the first place because of the rule. So this 18,000 is those that apply and were rejected.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I suppose one of the other things that should be mentioned is a very steep increase in the cost of making an application. Running into a family that involves a spouse, a partner, and a couple of children, where you're talking about several £1,000s just in order to complete the paperwork. So there's a huge, and none of which is recoverable in the event that your application is refused. Then you lose that money. So our feeling is that people are being very sensible and getting advice prior to making the application as to what likelihood is their applications are going to succeed. And you're quite right, it's very likely it's got a very substantial chilling effect on people simply not even making the application in the first instance.
Okay, David.
I mean, given the overwhelming democratic desire to bring immigration levels down to more moderate levels, don't you think it's sort of fair that family reunion should take its share, as it were? And I would also say that certainly some people I know in some of these communities we've been talking about, particularly the Kashmiri Pakistani community, are very supportive of government pressure in this area because of the impact on integration, or the negative impact on integration of the first generation in every generation assume. Added to which one might say that a very significant majority of ethnic minority Brits are in favour of reducing immigration to more moderate levels. It's less than the percentage of the existing population, but it's pretty high. And actually I've been rather surprised by how muted the opposition has been to the tightening of these rules.
On the issue of family taking its share, I suppose my response to that would be that there are a lot of trade-offs involved in this. It might be a reasonable proposition if it's a settled will of government that they do want to bring down immigration. But if the effect of that is to load huge disadvantages on a section of a population which really are playing by the rules and doing the best they possibly can in order to get by, and they're suddenly finding that they're, and the sort of instances that we're finding out about, it's not that people abandon their families as a consequence of a refusal. What you're often doing, particularly cases where we have of young women with children in the country, finding that their husbands can't join them, and they've got a prolonged period in front of them doing the best they can on extremely low incomes. Opportunities for taking employment
you don't think there is
are
an
very
integration,
limited.
you don't think there's an integration issue here at all when we're talking about communities which have very, very large numbers of people, 1 million or more, several million, of people from their own background who they could marry, who were already socialised into British ways. You don't think the integration issue counts at all here?
I mean, we're used to dealing with people who have got married. Whether they could have married somebody else, I suppose, is an interesting question, and you might want to look at, ask them that if you feel so inclined. But when you're dealing with a situation of somebody who, for example, a young woman, a law graduate that we were dealing with, who married, who went back to Pakistan, married a young man that her family had felt very strongly about. To all intents and purposes was completely devoted and committed to this marriage, but arrived back in the UK to resume her career as prospect of a prolonged period on a low income as a trainee solicitor, and then being dismayed to find out that the prospect of her husband ever being able to join her in anything like the near future simply wasn't there. That seems to be some quite a grave injustice, and it really ought to be rectified.
Don, can I ask you about possible changes to this system? Imagine that a future government was committed to having an income threshold, and you might, shift the level of it, down to the, full-time work at lower pay or something. But apart from shifting the level of it, tell us something about that if you want. What are the other more incremental changes that could possibly make a difference to some of the people in this situation?
I think there's a new test of the human rights dimension to it. I mean, theoretically, the immigration rules allow the income requirement to be set aside if there is justification for doing so on human rights ground. The problem is that the government has appended to its Immigration Act its own interpretation of what the merits of a human rights argument are, and they are pretty restrictive, and they don't particularly assist people who simply want to have a family life and believe that they've got good reasons for choosing their family life to have in this country. But I think
I was thinking of things like, at the moment only one of the incomes can count. And so it would be a pretty minor change to say if either partner. Are there other things like if either partner meets the threshold, then it wouldn't matter who it was. Are there other things of that?
I'd say third-party sponsorship as well. If it is the case that the sponsor is typically working part-time, a woman who, because of childcare arrangements, isn't able to take full-time employment and is therefore on a relatively low income, but her parents can demonstrate that they've got the assets and the capital in order to guarantee an income for the couple, then that seems to be perfectly reasonable. That should be. It used to be the case. It was always permitted in the past, but now it's explicitly excluded.
And wasn't that open to abuse? Wasn't it excluded for a reason, precisely because it encourages marriages that, for example, are the will of the parents, who then act as sponsor?
I don't think there was anything in that particular arrangement, because in any event, the sponsor was the spouse. The spouse was merely referring to her parents as another element in the application to demonstrate that they met one of the requirements of the rules. It wasn't it would have been extremely difficult, I think, if the sponsoring partner had been coerced for that not to have been picked up during the course of the application being made.
Natasha, I'm going to come to you now. So you were saying detention centres are particularly problematic for women who suffer gender-based violence. What's the alternative?
Well, there are already alternatives to detention. There's reporting in the community. The government can use tagging if they want. There's no need to use detention at all. I mean, about 6,000 women claim asylum in their own right each year. About 2,000 women were detained in 2012. So the majority of those claiming asylum are not detained. There's no need to detain at all. And I think we can learn from the ending of the detention of children for immigration purposes, which the coalition government ended, which didn't lead to any problems. I mean, we were told right during the campaign against the detention of children that if families couldn't be detained, there'd be a huge rise in absconding, there'd be massive problems about affecting removals. In fact, when the detention of children was ended, there was no problem at all. There was no rise in absconding. There is no problem in affecting removals. Detention is completely unnecessary. At the moment, only 1/3 of those detained in Yarlswood Detention Centre, where women are held, leave the detention centre to be removed. The rest re-enter the community anyway to go on with their asylum claim. So it's been completely unnecessary. And of course, it's also very expensive. I mean, I've been arguing on the grounds of the harm that it does to the individual. But I mean, if you want to look at it also, in the wider economic picture, it is very expensive to detain somebody, much more expensive than being able to pursue their asylum claim in the community.
Well, why is it that the 2,000 out of 6,000 are detained? I mean, what's different about the two compared to the 4,000?
It's a very good question. I mean, as you may know, the Home Office is not always entirely accountable and transparent in the way that it carries out its policies. So it's very hard to work out sometimes what is different about those detained compared to those who are able to carry on in the community. Some of them have been routed onto the detained fast track, where the asylum claim is heard at speed in detention, and there are massive problems with the screening process for that. So many people with complex claims go through the detained fast track. And you may know that recently been a court case that found the detained fast track was unlawful because it didn't allow people a fair hearing. Some will have been picked up because they're said to have breached reporting requirements. But often we find that just, that box has been ticked when it just hasn't been the case, where somebody's picked up in the reporting centre. And then often the box ticked on the form of why you were detained is because your removal is imminent. But we know many people who have been detained because their removal is meant to be imminent, who've been held for weeks, months, even up to a year. So it's very problematic. I should stress again that I'm talking about detention among those seeking asylum, and many of those held in detention are not seeking asylum, but I'm concentrating. So all my figures are coming from that cohort, those seeking asylum.
One question in 2 sessions back, a couple of the experts talked about the problems that those seeking asylum face, and there was stuff around legal representation, asylum seekers' knowledge of the system, as well as being restricted from the job market and accessing work. Is there anything in particular for women which is in addition to those?
I would absolutely agree with all of those issues. I mean, I was focusing on the detention issue because it's something very clear-cut that we think you could make an immediate recommendation for reform. Those huge issues in access to legal representation, which we feel is particularly problematic for women, because many women are making claims on the basis of gender-related persecution. The case law is quite complicated around gender-related persecution, and if women don't have any knowledge of the law, they may not know what evidence is relevant to their asylum claim, and they may hold back on disclosing things that may be relevant. So if a woman doesn't have a good lawyer, we feel it very often will stand in her way in being able to make a successful claim. You also mentioned restrictions on working, and of course people being left destitute if they've been refused asylum or unable to return to their home country. We feel this is also a particular problem among women because of their vulnerability to sexual exploitation. We don't have figures on that, but anecdotally among the women that we work with, we hear many stories about women. This runs the gamut from women being forced into prostitution or entering the sex industry unwillingly to entering transactional relationships where they're basically sleeping with men for food and shelter. And when you think that so many of these women have fled precisely those situations, they've crossed borders to flee those situations, they carry that trauma with them. They come to this country and our Home Office puts them in a situation where they're vulnerable to exactly that violence again.
Natasha, can I ask you, and we were talking earlier as well about the training of those who make the decisions, and clearly in terms of specific issues for women who've faced violence and rape, that's a big thing you're talking about here. Are there any examples of cultural shifts outside of the immigration system? I don't know if the police's approach, which is that being drawn on in the immigration asylum system, and could it be more? And I suppose the other thing that strikes me about what you're saying is, I mean, the values behind the sorts of advocacy you're making here are very similar in many ways to the values behind, say, the modern slavery bill that this government has tried to introduce, but it's a sort of on a different topic alongside it. Is there any opportunity to sort of draw on that?
I welcome both those points. I agree that the kind of issues that we're talking about are issues that the government seems aware of in other areas. And so, for instance, if you look at the modern slavery bill, we work with women that have been trafficked into this country, maybe forced into prostitution or other forms of labour exploitation, but when picked up by immigration authorities are treated as offenders rather than victims and survivors. This is a big issue for us. And I think that your point about learning from other areas of Home Office work is so important, and it's one we've made to the Home Office on a number of occasions. I know other organisations have as well, that we feel the learning done by the police, the criminal justice process is precious, and it could be shared now with UK visa and immigration.
I'm really glad we've touched on sexual exploitation, because I was going to ask about that, and I've been wondering in particular if there are difficulties that charities and organisations like yours face in providing the kind of support that other women who are not asylum seekers, who are not in detention, but who are resident in Britain, are able to access anywhere. I'm thinking things like whether they actually have the physical freedom to get to a refuge that you're running. What changes would you like to see to make it easier?
I mean, obviously, I wouldn't say for a moment that things are perfect for survivors of gender-based violence, who are UK residents already. But I think definitely there are huge extra problems that I think women in the asylum process face when they're trying to access services. And unfortunately, of course, the services aren't able often to cope with the extra needs. I mean, there's been wonderful work done by some organisations to try and ensure that their services are appropriate and are accessible, but it's very, very difficult, and particularly again going back to women who might have been refused asylum and have what's called no recourse to public funds, and the difficulties they might have in accessing refuges. I mean, there's been some excellent work done in this area, but it's still very much the case. I mean, the women we work with are often, they're not getting the help they need. I mean, I'll just give you one example. There was one woman that we worked with recently who was living destitute, who was sleeping rough, and we were carrying out just a piece of research, asking people about their experiences of living destitute. And she mentioned to the peer research that was talking to her that she'd been raped while sleeping rough. And the woman said, well, have you gone to the police? Have you gone for counselling? She said, well, I can't contact the police. I'm so scared of them. And I just think, there's that great sort of inbuilt fear as well, often of being able to access justice.
So specific proposals?
Well, my specific, aside from looking at the detention system, we'd like to see an end to the detention of women seeking asylum, and particularly, as an immediate step, an end to the detention of survivors of torture and other sexual violence. Home Office policy states that victims of torture should only be detained in exceptional circumstance, but that policy is not being carried out in practice, and it should be. And we'd like to see a time limit on detention. But we would also like to see an improvement in asylum decision making, and I think you've already heard evidence around that issue, and real leadership in challenging the culture of disbelief. And we also think it is really important for everyone passing through the asylum process to have access to good legal representation. And we're very concerned that cuts to legal aid are threatening that, even though people seeking asylum are still eligible for legal aid. Because of the cuts in the area, it's harder and harder to find decent immigration solicitors, particularly outside London. I'll keep my recommendations brief. I'll stop there.
I mean, I don't want to sound facetious, but you're making it sound as if there are things that are worse than being detained. I mean, sleeping rough or being forced into prostitution, when it may be people might actually prefer to be detained than face these options.
It's really interesting you ask that. I mean, when I was invited to attend this here, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to attend, I asked if I could come with an ex-detainee, and I feel slightly shy about sort of speaking up for people about what's worse and what's better, and I think, you know, one has to listen to the women themselves. But there's one woman we work with who was detained 3 times in this country, and she also slept rough and was vulnerable to violence while she was sleeping rough. But she was categorical that the detention she found really the hardest, and she was someone who had been imprisoned and raped in her home country for her political activities. Now she now has refugee status in this country. I mean, all that she went through, those 3 instances of detention, the period of being destitute, it was all completely unnecessary, you know. And when she actually got a decent lawyer and she went to her appeal hearing, she was given refugee status. But she always says that it's the detention here that she can't put out of her mind, because that's when she felt that she lost hope, as though she was completely alone.
Do you think more money would help here? I mean, the amount of money that the whole Borders Agency consumes every year is absolutely trivial in terms of 0.3% of public spending.
I know. I don't think, I mean, around the detention issue, it would actually be cheaper not to detain people in terms of investing in the in UK visa immigration, you know, what used to be UK Border Agency. I mean, clearly there's some spend there, but I think it would pay off so much if there was better quality decision making at the beginning, so people weren't caught in the system for years and years and years. And John Vine's report on the backlog, you know, in the UK Border Agency, those boxes and boxes of unopened mail that he found in the offices. I mean, it's just shocking, I think, how, you know, how money is being wasted. So yes, I think in order to build an asylum process that is transparent, that is fair, that is humane, obviously would require some investment, but as you say, not a huge investment. It wouldn't eat up a huge amount of money.
Great. Do you have any of you any final points you want to make that you feel that you haven't at this stage?
I'd just like to say again, you know, I'm glad to be here, and I do hope that you look at this issue of how one can build a fair and humane asylum process within the wider immigration picture, because I think it is important that that really doesn't get lost. And I know that there is a fear. I mean, we hear this fear from people that we talk to, and I think it's worth, you know, confronting it head on, that if we make the system fairer and more humane, people sort of flood over the borders to take advantage of it. From our experience talking to the women we work with, they don't really know anything about what goes on here in terms of the asylum process. And we feel that if there was a dignified, fair and humane process, it wouldn't be about increasing numbers, but it would be about ensuring that those who cross our borders seeking protection were treated in a dignified way.
Yes, I think using the opportunity of a commission like this to make the case that immigration policy, as far as families are concerned, I think is actually a conservative issue. It goes to the heart of the issue of family life, and it is the case that people who work in migrant communities know that the issue of integration, for example, is actually tremendously stepped up when people begin to form family units. Talking to my son the other day, teaches in a primary school in Finsbury Park, where the biggest intake is Somali children in that area. But the cluster, the social policy agenda that opens up when you've got the opportunity to engage with Somali mums at their school gate and to bring them inside the school as well and find out what's really going on in their family lives and to participate at that level. It does bring about, you know, leaps, in quantum leaps. And it was, I think, the errors in doing this in the past, the difficulties with the Pakistani and the Bangladeshi communities in the past, are part of the reasons why, if I can be so bold as to make it, the Conservative Party, even now, and Gujarati families and Punjabi families as well, who also experience tremendous difficulty with family reunification at different times, but the reasons why they have found it difficult to win support, it still remains stuck at around about the 15-20% mark, is because of a very deeply entrenched memory of the damage that was done for achieving family reunification during that period. So I think
that's very interesting, actually, because it's often attributed to, say, Enoch Powell's speech, for example, and some other things, but I haven't heard that argument come through as much. So that's That's very interesting. Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you for your time.